Hello and welcome to this episode 1 of Good Journeys with Second Mountain, inspiring stories and inspiring people. I'm your host, Ben Veal, founder of Second Mountain, meaningful comms for a brave new world. Joining me for my very first episode, I'm delighted to say, is Mr. Joshua Winning, nostalgia nut and fantasy fiction author. Josh is one of my oldest, dearest friends of about 30 years now, and one of the nicest, most kind-hearted people I know. But professionally, Josh
savage.
Josh is the author of multiple books, including the Sentinel Trilogy, Vicious Rumer, and most recently, the fantastic Shady Glass, a contemporary and very self-aware tribute to the classic escapist movies that we all grew up loving, such as Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, and the Neverending Story. Josh is also a senior film writer at the Radio Times. He's been writing for Total Film magazine for over a decade now and is the co-host of the Torn Stubs movie podcast. Josh has met pretty much every A-lister imaginable, been on set with Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy, devoured breakfast with zombies on The Walking Dead, and has even sat on the Game of Thrones Iron Throne. Plus, he once met Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, for which I am forever insanely jealous. Josh, welcome to the Good Journeys podcast. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, and I'm absolutely honoured, and it's a privilege to be part of your first ever episode, so thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to jump straight into questions on this episode 1. So, Josh, you've released The Shady Glass, which is a nostalgia-laced fantasy novel that pays homage to the brilliant decade that was the 1980s, earlier this year. How did the book come about, and why has it been such a personal story for you?
Books, okay, it's a very long story.
We have time.
We have time. The book basically came out of my love for those films that you mentioned at the top of the episode. And just this feeling of an absence of the fact that those films aren't really being made anymore. You know, these great standalone, philosophically interesting, but also sort of like adventurous, exciting fantasy films. They just aren't really being made anymore. They've kind of been, they've just fallen out of style, I guess. They've been replaced with big, enormous CGI summer blockbusters like Transformers, Marvel films, superhero films now rule the cinema. And I think that the initial idea was as simple as, I want to write a book about 1980s movie puppets. And I didn't have, any story to hang that on. I didn't have any kind of emotional hook to hang it on. All I knew was that I missed 80s puppet films like Labyrinth and Neverending Story, and just wanted more of them. I know how difficult it is to make a movie, so I thought, well, I can kind of write books-ish, so I'm going to try to write a book about puppets instead. It was just driven by that pure love for those films, basically, and wanting more of them, and also thinking, if I love these films, that means other people love these films and might be feeling the same way I am, which is kind of like, give us more. Where are these films? They've just disappeared. So that was what I attempted to do with The Shady Glass, was to kind of fill that void in our souls that has been left behind by Jim Henson. And it didn't really become a thing until I discovered the character of Jack, who is the hero in the book. He starts out as kind of a bit of an anti-hero. He's a guy in his 30s. He's completely, to put it unkindly, lost the plot. His father was a film director in the 80s. His father, Bob, he made the film called The Shady Glass, and that film flopped when it was released. Nobody really understood what this thing was. Was it for kids? Was it for grown-ups? Was it scary? Was it not scary? It flopped, and that kind of, the effect of that, it ruined the relationship between Jack and his father. And so the story begins when the father, the director, has died, and Jack is now sort of having to clear out his father's home. He rediscovers all this movie paraphernalia from his childhood, from this movie that has come to represent everything he hates about his father and everything he hates about life. And essentially, he has to go on a quest with the puppets from his father's film, who miraculously spring to life. And he kind of goes on a journey of self-discovery through this adventure that he has with these puppets, is the gist. And yeah, it became, you know, a very personal thing. You know, my father, at the time of me coming up with this idea, he was, his second wife was, had terminal cancer. She was pretty much passing away. And so I was spending lots of time with my dad and just sort of like thinking about our relationship, and probably coming to terms with the fact that one day he's going to die as well. And, you know, my mum passed away when I was 21. It was this catastrophic event within our family. And as I've got older, and as my father has got older, I think I've just become more and more aware of the fact that one day he's going to be gone as well, which seems impossible, because for every up and down that we've all had in our lives, he's always been there, and he's always been the same. You know him. He's energetic, go get him, you know, such a, you know, just full of so much life and energy. And so I think this book partly was kind of coming to terms with the idea that he wouldn't always be around. So yeah, massively personal, which you wouldn't necessarily think when I talk about it as a 1980s puppet love letter book. But yeah.
And how's that been for your relationship between you and your dad?
It's been really good, actually. He's one of the first readers of the book. I sent him a very early draft. He used to be a teacher, so he sent me back a long letter about what was wrong with it, which was fine, and some of it was good and it was useful. But he was very much of an early champion of the book. He's been with me there every step of this journey, which, you know, it's the book that got me an agent. It's the book that got me a deal with Titan Books, who are a publisher that I love, and were actually the dream publisher for this book. So it's been great. You know, my dad came to a convention that I did in July as well. There's the Young Adult Literary Convention in London. And I told Dad that I was doing this, and his response was, well, I'll come. And so he did. And he came along, and he sat in the panel, watched me doing a panel discussion about fantasy books. We went to the pub afterwards. He met my agent, he met my publicist, he met another editor at Titan. And it was just this ridiculously sort of bizarre day, but really great. And I was so happy to have him there.
I saw the photos you put out on social, and yeah, it just made me smile the biggest smile. I loved that he was your press agent, wasn't he, on the day, or your publicist on the day? Pretty sure.
They'd run out of passes that said guest, and so his pass said publicist, which was just hilarious, because actually he is sort of like my invisible
He is your publicist.
He goes around my hometown where I grew up, where he still lives. He goes into the shops all the time, checking the books in stock. You know, if he sees anybody picking it up, he leans over their shoulder and says, "Oh, you should read that. It's really good." So yeah, he is my publicist.
Quite right too. I mean, yeah. What I love about the journey you've been on, I mean, we've known each other since we were maybe 8 or 9, and this has been your dream for as long as I've known you. I remember when you were maybe early teens, you were working on early drafts of what would ultimately become the Shadow Glass, the beautiful cover. There we are. Really, really sings to me from that the kind of style and the things that you were into, going back 20 years. How did you personally approach writing the Shadow Glass? And this isn't your first book now. What's the starting point for you on the writing journey before you begin to put pen to paper?
This one was like quite an involved sort of process, which I haven't really done since. And I don't know if I'll do again. I think it depends on the book. I think every book demands something different. I always roll out this quote, which was Jane Goldman talking to Neil Gaiman at a dinner. And he said to her, "I finally discovered how to write a book doing American Gods." And she said, no, you've just discovered how to write this book, which I think is that sticks with me, because it is like every book is different. Every book is a different challenge. So to answer your question, the process with this one was essentially I had this idea of puppets. I then had this sort of like idea about Jack and his emotional journey. And it was basically a sort of, the process here was like coming up with what is the story of the book? What is the story of the movie in the book? And what is the world in the movie in the book? And what is the world of the book itself? So many sort of like logical things I had to figure out that aren't necessarily in the book in any more than they are sort of just like a feeling or like a general understanding of sort of the setup. You know, it was a very in-depth sort of process of like, I had a notebook. It was a notebook that my mum gave me when I was a teenager before she passed away. And it's a notebook that I haven't touched since that time. You know, it's been 20 something years since my mum passed away. I've had this notebook through how many house moves, and I've never used it because I didn't feel like there was anything good enough to use it for until the Shadow Glass. And I got home from going food shopping and I just suddenly thought, right, I'm going to start planning out Shadow Glass in this notebook. It just felt right. And so I started brainstorming characters, brainstorming sort of like situations. So like the situation of Jack's relationship with his father, the situation of his father's attempt to make this film, and then the film flopping, and then going into breaking down the actual plot of the movie that was made and flopped in the 80s, figuring out who those characters were, which characters from that film were actually going to come to life within the story of the book, which ones weren't, and just sort of asking myself questions as well. So there's a page quite far into my planning where I just wrote to myself, what does the Shadow Glass actually do? Because the Shadow Glass is this sort of mystical object within the world of this film, but I hadn't figured out quite what it actually did and why anyone cared about it. And you know, asking myself those questions helped me to figure out what that thing was, but also what it meant in relation to Jack. I think everything had to come back to Jack essentially, because this is his story. So that's why the Shadow Glass mirror in the story of the Shadow Glass, it kind of challenges you. It challenges you to be the best person you could possibly be. And if you don't meet that challenge, you're basically sort of like sucked into it, never to be seen ever again, which obviously has an emotional resonance within Jack, who is sort of, for all intents and purposes, like failing at life. You know, he's seen his father failing, therefore Jack says, I'm not going to commit to anything, because if I don't commit to anything, I'm never going to fail at it. And with this story, forces him to commit to something and actually believe in something at his own peril. You know, that's a very long-winded answer, but that's essentially what I did.
No, it's very powerful. And also one of the things that I really loved about the book, and that I think gives it its real pace and contemporary spin and just makes it so incredibly readable, is how you've interspersed chapters with contemporary film reviews, with historic blogs, with critiques from film authors. There's obviously a lot of overlap between your time as a fiction writer and your time as a journalist. How did you find bringing those two worlds together?
It just felt like the right fit for this book. It's always been that way. Like even in the early stages of writing this book, I always knew that I was going to have these found documents, and I hadn't even heard the term mixed media books, but apparently this is a mixed media book because it has these articles and transcripts and all this kind of stuff. So it was very much part of the early building blocks of the book. And I think you're right, it's because I'm a journalist. I've spent 14, 15 years working as a journalist, pretty much coming out of university. And journalism has had a huge impact on my development as a writer. You know, when I started out, I wanted to write books. And when I sort of couldn't quite figure out how to do that, that's when I moved into journalism, because I went to my a lecturer at my university, and she said, just go into journalism. And I was a bit like, man, I'm not sure about that. But actually, I've loved being a journalist. And being a journalist, I wouldn't be the writer I am today for all the faults, etc., etc., if I hadn't been a journalist first. I don't think. I think they're so complementary in so many ways. And so when I was writing this book, because it's about a film and it's set in the world of fandom, you know, people who love this film in the book, it just felt right to have these documents. And I think like a nice sort of side effect of that is that when you're reading the book, hopefully you start to feel like this is a real film. And also you hopefully start to almost feel like a bit of a fan of this film as well, because you're reading all these documents that have probably been collected by fans. You know, I've got these books, maybe you've even seen them, but I've got these scrapbooks that I had as a teenager where I would print off pages on the internet, like film reviews and movie stills and interviews. I'd cut them out of magazines and I would paste them all into these books, which I think I call them Dark Visions. And I've got 3 of them. And they are full of movie stuff, like this, like the movie memorabilia that is in the Shadow Glass. I was doing as a teenager. So it's definitely sort of, yeah, it's just the book is so completely a kind of a distillation of all the stuff that I've done professionally and non-professionally for a long, long time.
Well, I think, you know, I think it really shows. And one of the things I've really admired about you following your writing journey over the years, Josh, has been, you know, you've really had conviction in yourself. And, you know, I know that at times self-belief can waver throughout this, and it can be a very lonely thing being a writer, but you've really grinded and you've continued. And what I'd be really interested for our audience to hear a bit more about is your writing journey. So going back to the Sentinel trilogy, the self-publishing, how you managed to kind of essentially get to the point you are now of being signed with Titan Books.
Yeah, it's a long, long journey. Some people get lucky and they, you know, they're fished out of the you know, enormous ocean of writers desperately trying to get picked up. You know, sometimes that happens immediately. Oftentimes it doesn't. You know, the whole overnight success thing, it very, very rarely happens. And I think the thing that's really kept me going is sort of like just trying to, it's like self-betterment, you know, trying to get as good as I possibly can at this thing, trying to improve with every book, every draft, you know, every paragraph, you know, trying to be a better writer. And I don't really know where that comes from. I guess it's a passion. It's just something that I've always loved doing, you know, from a very, very young age when I was writing stories that were inspired by the books that I loved at that time, you know, like rewriting books that I loved to change the ending or to cut out the stuff that I didn't like in the book. You know, sometimes I would think books were too long, frankly, when I was a kid. So I would just cut out the stuff I didn't like and just write my own version. And it's just something that I find endlessly fascinating, is the craft of writing. So yeah, I think that it's trying to become the best I possibly can become. And I think the self-doubt thing, it never goes away, no matter how quote unquote successful you are. You know, from the outside, you can look like the most successful person in the world, but that doesn't mean that's how you feel on the inside. So when I look at the Shadow Glass objectively, I'm like, yeah, okay, like that looks like a pretty cool book actually. And I could make all kinds of assumptions about the person who wrote it and how successful they are, and you know, what their life might look like, how much money they're making, you know, the people they're meeting. You could come up with all this kind of stuff. And invariably, none of it is going to be what you think it is. And actually, probably most writers are very similar in that they just sit and write in a room all day and very occasionally something exciting happens. So yeah, success and like self-doubt, it's funny how they don't they don't, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, they go hand in hand. And I don't think I'll ever go away. I don't think I'll ever not doubt myself. I think I can tell a story, and I think I can write reasonably capably, but there's always going to be somebody out there who'll tell me that I can't. You know, there's always going to be bad reviews. But I think that's why, so for a start, I try not to read that many reviews. I think there's like a kind of a rule on social media for people who write reviews, which is basically, if you don't like a book, please don't tag the author in that review, because nobody wants to read negative things about themselves, and you have no idea what kind of impact that's going to have on that human being who sees that. So I like being tagged in positive reviews, because on the one hand, it does kind of create this little bubble, this utopian bubble where you're like, everyone loves it, it's amazing. But also it just means that you are reminded that people do love your stuff. I think previously I've gone looking for reviews, and you do just find bad reviews. So, you know, when the first Sentinel book first came out, I was obsessed with getting reviews, reading reviews. And it, in some ways, the reviews are helpful. Yeah, there it is. Sometimes they're helpful because you can get good feedback, especially as like a first-time author where you're still learning and you don't have maybe a professional who's there helping you out like I do now. But also, like, sometimes they're just not very nice, you know, and they put words and sentences in your brain that you just wish you could get rid of, and they stick harder than the positives. It's all the positive things I've read, I couldn't quote them. I could easily quote about 5 of the bad reviews that I've read. And these are reviews that I read years ago. So yeah, what was the question? I got on a bit of a tangent.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, what I think is really interesting is, you know, you say that, and I know the impact that has from conversations we've had before about social media. But you're very active on social. You've still got a very strong presence on Twitter and Instagram, especially. I mean, where do you land on social media? I mean, as a writer who's kind of built up this groundswell of fans largely because you've been quite an open personality on social, do you think you would have got to the level of success you've reached now without social media?
Social media I found really useful for connecting with people who are having a similar experience to you. You know, it's great for normalizing your own sort of not issues, but for normalizing your experience, or, you know, your frustrations. Twitter's been great for meeting people who love the same stuff that I love, and for meeting people who are writers, who want to be writers, and sharing experiences. You know, there's nothing better than reaching out to somebody via direct message and just sort of being like, I'm having like a bit of a crap experience with this particular thing. What's your experience been with that? And then them kind of going, oh my God, don't get me started. You know, there's something about that is just so lovely, because you suddenly don't feel alone. And I think social media can be a powerful tool to stop you feeling like you're just sort of like, you know, adrift in this sea of despair. I think you have to draw a line, and I think the line is a very personal choice. I know that I have found that my ability to like self-regulate how often I go on social media has sort of, my grip on that has slackened a lot, to the point where you would maybe use the word like addicted, which I know is a very loaded term, but I think that it's overuse, maybe, you know, overusing something is never particularly good, I don't think. So I try to regulate my use of social media. It's difficult on the laptop. That's the most difficult place to regulate it, because on my phone, I just did it yesterday. I deleted the Twitter app and the Instagram app and my email app. I deleted them all off my phone. I do it regularly when I can feel that I'm just sort of not in control of this anymore. I don't like the sort of compulsion to go on to something for no other reason other than I've thought to do it, you know? you know, it's filling time that feels like dead time, but actually that dead time is so invaluable for so many reasons, not least for creatives who need that sort of daydream time. And I think social media kills daydreaming dead. So I become aware quite quickly if I'm overusing social media, and I'll take measures to try to limit it. But I do find that the laptop is where it's most difficult, because short of blocking the website, you can just kind of go on and unlock it, often at the touch of a fingertip, if you use the fingertip ID for passwords. So yeah, there's obviously pros and cons, and yeah, it can get out of control. But I think that if you're aware of how you're using those things, then it's possible to have a healthy relationship with them.
It's interesting. I mean, you know that I've written about social media addiction. You and I have had similar conversations around kind of, I guess what you describe as unintentional use, as in you're not really going online specifically to look for something. You're there to kill time. And I agree with you, but from a creative standpoint, it's a very dangerous zone, because you're losing sight of the boredom, quite frankly, the boredom that comes where great ideas can sometimes arise, and just connection with your surroundings. I wonder, when you go and write, so when you know you're on a deadline, or you know you've got to try and deliver X amount of thousands of words in a day to meet your kind of next chapters, do you take yourself out of your office? Do you go to cafes? How do you kind of try and get that discipline to avoid looking on time wasted social media sites and just get on with what you need to do?
I kind of mix it up. I kind of just see how I'm feeling on that day. I think if I've got a time constraint, like you said, so if I've got like, okay, I have this 1 week to finish this draft, no matter how rubbish it is, just get it finished, which I did a couple of weeks ago. I turned off the internet on my laptop, and I was really strict. And I kind of said to myself, look, you can go on maybe at midday, and you can go on at the end of the day, and that's it. And I was really strict with it, and it did slide towards the end of the week. But for the first couple of days, I found it really useful to just switch off the internet completely, to just focus on writing. And sometimes it's, you know, if I've had quite a busy time out of the house, it can feel great to write in the house. But if I've done nothing but be in the house for a couple of days, it's great to go somewhere else to write. But I do find that more and more I find it difficult to find somewhere outside of the house that is conducive to writing. There's just so many distractions. It can be noisy, you know, go to cafes and stuff. Sometimes they can be really noisy. It's also just really expensive to go into cafes. Like, I went to a cafe this morning. I spent £10 on a coffee and like a breakfast, which is just nuts, especially if you're a writer. It's like, what? So yeah, it's a balance, I think, between getting out and staying in. Depends how you feel on that day.
Did you find kind of writing throughout the pandemic, especially when we were in the really enforced lockdowns, how did you find that when you didn't have the opportunity to mix it up and you just had to stay in your office every day and work?
Oh, it was a great challenge for the imagination, because it was sort of like, let's imagine a world where I can go outside right now and go into a shop and have a dramatic encounter with somebody who isn't wearing a mask. You know? Yeah, I found, because I'd been a freelance journalist for 12, 13 years before the lockdown happened, I kind of didn't really find it that sort of difficult to begin with, because I was quite used to working from home anyway and finding ways to cope with that. It was the longer the pandemic and the isolating went on, that's when it really started to become a struggle. Like, I was actually really quite productive in the first couple of lockdowns. I was really productive. I was writing just like a silly sort of rom-com-y thing that isn't normally what I would write, but it was just like a fun thing to do, good distraction. And luckily, the Titan deal happened sort of like slap bang in the middle of the pandemic, so I had something really positive to focus on. But yeah, it's kind of now actually weirdly is more difficult because this is now my lockdown house. This is my lockdown work environment. So now it feels like I've been in this flat for a long time, even though I've only lived here for 2.5 years. This is now the lockdown isolation zone. And so it's actually more difficult now to write here, I think. Because if you think about it, how long do you really spend somewhere that you live, especially outside of sort of a pandemic or whatever? You actually would, in the previous world, you would probably spend most of your time out of the house. So to have that flipped and actually spend pretty much all of your time in your house, it's weird, and especially when you throw work into the mix as well. So it's trying now.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable balance. I think you hear that phrase, your home is your castle, and I think it should be the place you return home to, having been on your adventures. And for many of us now, we have to try and challenge that. Now we have to, as you say, go out and try and have experiences and come home refreshed to our homes. But with so many of us still working from our homes, that kind of delineation becomes very difficult. But I guess we're still learning what this kind of brave new world looks like, aren't we?
Well, it's like sort of like can work, should work. You're like, well, I physically could work right now, but it's like, no, it's 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening. You could write, sure, your laptop is right there, but do you think that would be good for you to write at the moment, or do you think actually you should sit down and read a book or watch something or play a game? Do something different. So I think it's finding that like self-discipline, I guess, and self-forgiveness maybe, of just going, yeah, I could write at the moment, but I don't think I should. In fact, I think I should.
That brings me on to a question I really wanted to ask, which was, you are now a successful author. You just have to own that title and accept it. How would you, what tips would you give to an aspiring writer, someone who feels like we all apparently have a book in us, but what tips would you give to someone who really desperately wants to start out but just doesn't know where to begin?
Okay, I think you have to write something that you can't not write, essentially. I think that you have to really want to sit down at that computer or that notebook, however you do it, sit down and just write what you want to read, which is what I did with all of my books. I think these are stories that I just was like, I want these stories to be out in the world. Don't really understand why, but I just know that that's what, I can't find them anywhere else, was a big reason. So I think that's a big one. I think that this is a really tough question, because the thing is, nobody knows anything. This is what me and my friend talk about all the time, is that people who seem to know what they're talking about probably don't. People who are giving you advice on writing, well, that's their way. That doesn't mean it's going to be your way. It's really tricky. I think the basics are read as much as you can, read widely, read lots of different types of books. I think that crime thrillers actually really influenced the pace of the Shadow Glass, because crime thrillers just move, and I wanted Shadow Glass to move. So it's funny where you draw inspiration from everywhere. I think perfectionism is a big thing to get over, and that's something I battle with constantly, is that feeling of it's rubbish and there's nothing I can do because it's never going to be perfect. And I think that it's important to just be like, yeah, it's probably never going to be perfect. Nothing in the world is ever perfect. So do you want to write anyway? To kind of just push through that, essentially. And I think the hardest one, but the biggest one, is finish the draft. Just finish it. And it sounds really simple, and it sounds a bit cavalier and sort of dismissive, but it's the biggest, most important thing you can do, is finish your story. It could be too short, it could have gaps in it, it could be too long, you know, it could be too waffly, but there's nothing worse than having a blank page and this kind of like, I can work with words, I can work with those, but I can't work with a blank page. So I think it's very important, finish that draft. It's probably going to be awful. Mine always are. My first drafts are always terrible. And I've heard other authors say this, which is very heartening, because I'm like, you're my hero. Your first drafts are bad? Okay, good. I mean, they're not as bad as my first drafts, but at least yours are bad. So I think finishing is huge, because then you've got something to work with. Like my friend, she just finished a first draft, and we both call our first drafts vomit drafts, because they are basically just sick on a page, just rubbish. But she said, I've got a lump of clay, which I think is a lovely way to look at it. You've got that lump, and now you can start to mold it into something that you want it to be.
I think it's an incredible skill to be a fiction author, especially, you know, within your world of fantasy fiction, because you've got this ability just through the words and blank page to take people on these incredibly immersive journeys. And just especially during, you know, the pandemic, how much we all relied on the escapism of books during that time. One thing that I you know, think would be really interesting to talk about is kind of what it's been like to essentially make it now. So with the Shadow Glass, so I know you're very uncomfortable with that term, but you know, the book has been really successful. You know, you were named Book of the Month by the Times. Everywhere I've seen, you know, you know, very critically acclaimed. It's really resonated with people, and it seems to have really struck a chord globally at a time where nostalgia is king. How does it feel to, I guess, have the book out there and to have made a connection with so many people?
Oh, it's amazing. That was the reason I wrote it. You know, I wrote it for the people who loved the stuff that I did and just wanted more of it. And my fear, I had two big fears, and they were, one, we're not going to find those people, and two, we're going to find them and they're going to hate it. You know, they're the two things I was really worried about. But actually, Titan have found those people. You know, various bloggers and reviewers are helping us find those people. They're finding each other. And as far as I've seen, people are enjoying it, which is amazing. You know, just, it's fantastic. They're my people, and I would be a liar if I said that I would be okay with them not enjoying the stuff that I love. You know, I don't necessarily believe it. I don't, you know, there's always that little voice that says, oh, they're just being nice. But then you think, well, they are strangers. They don't need to be nice to you. So yeah, it's great. It feels lovely. And the knock-on effect of that is that I'm like, well, no one's going to like the next book I write. You know? But like, okay, they might have liked this one, but then, oh my God, the next one, no, they're all going to hate that. So, you know, there's always, you never feel like you've made it. There is no making it. There really isn't.
What I always love about following anyone that kind of follows you on social will see this, that you're very self-deprecating about the writing journey. So you'll often share a blank page and like, you know, oh, I've got to start, I've got to write this, and where do I begin? It's almost like no matter how many of these books you've written, you still seem quite daunted by the process to begin with. I mean, when you get into it, once you've got over that initial, I guess, kind of hump of beginning, does it feel like work, or do you find yourself fully drifting? I ask because I attended a talk once with Nick Hornby, one of my favourite authors, and you know, it really resonated with me where how he spoke quite candidly about how he had a specific office that he went to, and he would write from Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and when 5 o'clock came, he stopped writing, and he viewed it very rigidly as a Monday to Friday job. For him, that was how he was able to be so creative and to churn out the books that he has, was just by very much clearly delineating it from his life. But there's clearly much more overlap with you, and but the things you're writing about are also very, very personal to you and your personal passion points and interests. So, you know, what does it feel like work?
It does and it doesn't. It feels like I want to get something down, it feels like I want to sort of have a thing to pitch, to give to my agent for her to pitch out to publishers. You know, there's that feeling, but there also is that lovely creative feeling of, I just want to play, I just want to explore. I'm writing something at the moment which I've got the title, I've got the concept, I've got a one-page synopsis which covers maybe 2/3 of the story, but I haven't outlined it. I haven't broken it down into a chapter breakdown or anything yet. I'm not sure I will. I've just started writing it, and I'm really enjoying the sense of discovery with it. And I think that's something I've enjoyed with all of my books, is a feeling of discovery. It's trying to figure out, so you've got this idea of who your character is when you start writing, but that quickly actually sort of reveals itself as inadequate, because you can have a very quick, simple idea of who a person is, but when you've actually got to live in their head for 80, 90,000 words, you've got to figure out, well, what actually makes them tick and how do they feel about that? And creatives always talk about, what does your character want? I think that's a big thing that is sort of like one of those cornerstones of stories or character, maybe, is they kind of have to want something. And if they don't want anything, that in itself is sort of an interesting facet of the character. So yeah, I think it really does just feel like a nice mix of work and play. And it can be really frustrating. I always, so whenever I've got a draft that either I've kind of finished or it's kind of getting there, but not quite, I load it onto my Kindle and I sort of just start to read it as a book, essentially. And I'm only happy, I can only relax when there are no like klaxons going off. And a klaxon for me is like, it can be as big as, well, this chapter is an absolute car wreck, I need to get rid of it. Or it can be as small as, that word isn't quite right, or that word doesn't need to be there. And those klaxons, they get smaller and smaller the more times I read over the book. And I'm looking to kind of like breathe the book in. And I'm not happy until I can breathe it in. You know, it chokes you for a long time, can choke you for months. But eventually, I've got my eye on that point in the future when I'm going to be able to breathe it in. And it just feels like this was easy to write, even if it wasn't easy to write.
Do you read your books back afterwards once they're published?
I'd love to say no, because I think it sounds a bit like masturbatory if you say that you read your own books. I have done it in the past where, so the Sentinel books, years after they came out, I was at my aunt's house and she had book 3 and I hadn't read it in a while, and I picked it up and I just had a little read of it. And it's sort of like, these characters do become your friends. It sounds really cheesy, because obviously they are facets of you as a person, but you've spent so much time with these characters and you've like been through the wars with them, whether that is like editorially or narratively. And so it's quite nice to pick up the book sometimes. I pick up Shadow Glass a little bit and just flick through it, because I just think that Titan did such a beautiful job in terms of the design. But I don't read, I'm not ready yet to sort of just read it. I probably will in a couple of years' time. But I think maybe
it's pretty good.
It's all right, isn't it? 3 stars. Yeah, it's fine.
So what's next, then? You've mentioned that you're starting to work on something. Are we going to get a sequel to Shadow Glass?
I haven't planned a sequel. I've been really surprised by people's reactions to wanting a sequel, and kind of so many people have said to me, so there's going to be a sequel, right? And I'm like, I don't know. I think people often think they want a sequel when actually they want to experience the first one again for the first time, maybe, if that doesn't sound too horn-tooting. You watch the sequel because you want to recapture the feeling that you got from the first film. So, and very few storytellers are able to do that. So I'm not sure if I doubt my ability to write a good sequel is number one. And number two is finding the right story, because the reason I wrote The Shadow Glass was because I love puppets and I wanted to tell this story about Jack. Whereas to write a sequel, I can't have the reason just be, I want to write a sequel or people want a sequel. It has to be an organic sort of creative reason, I guess. And I could see a world where there's like Return to Shadow Glass or something like that. But maybe in like 10 years' time, I don't know. I feel like maybe I would have to be older, because Jack was my age when Jack's 35 in the book and I was 35 when I started writing Shadow Glass. So maybe I need him to be in his 40s or his 50s before he becomes a viable sequel character, So we'll see. But I mean, in the meantime, I've got a book called Burn the Negative coming out in the summer of 2023, which is still sort of like suffused with like movie love, but this time it's horror movies, 90s horror films. So that's coming out, and then I've got another horror book that was part of that deal, so I've got to write that. I've got various projects sort of like bubbling away, so fingers crossed they'll all get out there.
You never stop, do you?
Never stop. Obsessed. I get really I get stressed, and I get more anxious than my usual level of anxiety if I'm not writing. I get annoyed, I get tetchy. I think writing for me is sort of therapy in a weird way. It's like self-expression through a story or through a character. And I find that if I'm like under an enforced, you're not going to write for a while because you've just finished something else. So, don't tire yourself out. And while there is that, it is important to take breaks. It's not necessarily good for me, maybe, to not have that outlet. I think if you love doing something, you love it no matter what. It doesn't matter if you've just finished a book. You can and should write another one.
Absolutely, and what a perfect note to finish on. So lastly, Josh, where can our audience find out more about you and stay updated with what you're working on? Plug away.
You can find me on Twitter at Josh Winning. I'm on Instagram at Joshua Winning. My website is joshuawinning.com. You can sign up to my newsletter through there if you'd like. I don't really send out many newsletters. It's only when there's sort of a little bit of news. And if you want to listen to my podcast, that's Torn Stubs, which is available on all, podcast platforms.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Josh. Thank you so much for being the first guest. This has been an absolute treat to do, and I'm so glad that we've been able to do this together. So this has been episode 1 of The Good Journeys with Second Mountain Comms. You can subscribe to us on YouTube at Second Mountain Comms. You can find us on Twitter at Second, that's 2ND Mountain UK, and you can join in the conversation using hashtag Good Journeys Pod. Until next time, let's keep climbing on together.